Good evening and welcome to all joining us here this evening from across the globe. Tonight's class is dedicated by our dear friends David and Ida Schattenstein in the sacred memory of the Kedoshim of Mumbai and Rabbi Gavriel Noyach and Rivki Holtzberg. The Schattensteins also dedicate tonight's class in the loving memory of a young soul, Alta Shula Swerdlov, the daughter of Hindel and Rabbi Yossi Swerdlov from the holy city of Jerusalem. Tehei nishmasam tzurura b'tzuroir hachayim. They tell the anecdote about the rabbi, the priest, and the minister sitting in a Starbucks, sipping a latte, and discussing what they would like to hear people say at their funerals. The priest says, I'd love to hear people eulogize me as a true servant of the Lord, a man who was dedicated to the work of the Lord and to bringing the light of the Lord into the world. The minister says, I would like to hear people say about me, he was a true friend. You can rely on him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in middle of the day, in middle of the night. This was a man you can truly trust as a companion and as a friend and spiritual mentor. Rabbi, what about you? What would you like to hear people say at your funeral? And the rabbi says, I would like to hear somebody say at my funeral, you know, I think he's moving. This evening, we want to explore a lovely and fascinating story in the Talmud. Please open up your curriculums or source sheets right below the video. There is a PDF document with a source sheet. Please open it up. Source number 1. Zog de Gemara in Mesechet Tainis Daf Hey Amud Beis. This story is in Tractate Ta'anit, page 5b. The Talmud relates the following story. Rabbi Nachman v'Rav Yitzchak have Yosvi b'Sudasa. Rabbi Nachman and Rabbi Yitzchak, they were two of the greatest Talmudic sages of the time. Rabbi Nachman was one of the Amoraim, one of the Talmudic rabbis who lived in Babylonia, present-day Iraq. Rav Yitzchak was one of the Amoraim, the Talmudic sages who lived in the Holy Land. And the two are sitting together at a meal. Rabbi Nachman turns to Rabbi Yitzchak and says, let the master say something. Amar le, Rabbi Yitzchak responds to Rabbi Nachman, Hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So said Rabbi Yochanan, Ein mesichin besuda, shema yakdim kana leveshet v'yavel de sakana. You don't talk during a meal, because you might precede the windpipe to the esophagus, to the food pipe, and endanger yourself. As Rashi explains, if you're talking, the windpipe may open up and the food will get stuck there and the person could, God forbid, choke, and thus Rabbi Yochanan said, you should not be talking during a meal. Now, I know you may be thinking parenthetically, what do Jews do during a meal if they don't talk? Here the Talmud gives us a verdict in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that you're not supposed to schmooze during a meal. Most Jewish meals and feasts revolve around talking and debating and arguing and schmoozing and questions and answers and stories and so on and so forth. So it would just be good to mention as a footnote that the halachic authorities discuss this. Some permit conversation between courses. Other halachic sources explain that in Talmudic times they used to recline during the meal, and thus it was more dangerous, because indeed if you're talking while you eat you may choke. But today that we don't usually recline during our meal, this halachic verdict would not apply according to many sources and authorities. Back to the story. So when Reb Nachman asks Rabbi Yitzchak to say something during the meal, he quotes his teacher, his master Rabbi Yochanan, one of the greatest Talmudic sages living in the Holy Land, who said there's no talking during a meal, it's dangerous. Basar desod, after they finished eating, Amar lei, Rabbi Yitzchak turns to Rabbi Nachman and tells him, Hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So said Rabbi Yochanan, Yaakov Avinu loy meis. Jacob, our father, did not die. Amar lei, Rabbi Nachman said to Rabbi Yitzchak, V'chi bichdi sabtu sabdanaya, v'chantu chanetaya, v'kavru kavraya. Was it in vain that the eulogizers eulogized Jacob, and the embalmers embalmed Jacob, and the buriers buried Jacob? As the Torah explains in the portion of Vayechi, this week's portion, Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, when he died, was eulogized. He was embalmed. He was buried. So Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Nachman tells Rabbi Yitzchak, you say Yaakov Avinu never died. Was all this done in vain? Amar lei, Rabbi Yitzchak answers Rabbi Nachman, Mikra ani doirish. I expound this idea from a verse. Shenemar, the verse says in Jeremiah, in Yirmiyah, the book of Yirmiyah, Perek Lamed, Jeremiah chapter 30, Va'ata altira avdi Yaakov ne'um Hashem v'al teichas Yisrael ki hinini Moshiach meirachik ve'ezaracha me'eretz shavim. The verse speaks in the name of God, saying, you, my servant Jacob, do not fear. Israel, Yisrael, do not be frightened, because I will save you from afar and your children from the land of their captivity. So the verse speaks to Jacob and Israel individually, and then to his children. I will save you from far, and I will redeem your children from their captivity. Makishhu l'zarei. The verse compares him, Jacob, to his seed, to his offspring, to his children. Ma zarei b'chayim afu b'chayim. Just as his seed is alive, so too he is alive. As Rashi explains, when God says, I will redeem your children from their captivity, obviously they are alive. If they're dead, there's no need to liberate them from captivity. And he compares he to his children. I will save Israel. I will save Jacob, Yaakov and Yisrael, just like I will liberate his children. So he compares Jacob to his children just like they are alive. Zare b'chayim, afu b'chayim. Jacob is also alive. Hence, Rabbi Yitzchak says, from this verse I derive that Jacob didn't die. And the story continues. Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak now says something else to Rabbi Nachman, his partner at the meal. Kol ha'omer Rachav Rachav miyad nikri. Somebody who says the name Rachav Rachav twice will immediately emit a seed of life, will immediately discharge sperm. Amalei Rabbi Nachman tells Rabbi Yitzchak, Ana amina v'lo yichbas. I have said Rachav Rachav, and it didn't affect me, it didn't bother me. There were no consequences, nothing was emitted from the body. Amalei, Rabbi Yitzchak responded, Ki kamina. When did I say this? Biyodo makira. Only concerning one who is familiar with her and recognizes her. I did not mean that anybody in the world who says Rachav Rachav will emit seed. I met somebody who's Yoido Makira, somebody who knew Rachav, somebody who was familiar with Rachav. We'll discuss Rachav in a few moments, but Rachav was one of the most beautiful women of the time and of history. As the Talmud explains, Rachav is the woman to whom Joshua was the spies, when he sent spies and scouts to survey the land of Israel before he conquered it after Moses' death. Joshua sent 2 spies. And the Tanakh, the Torah teaches, the book of Yeshua tells us how they went up to Jericho and they remained in the house of Rachav. And Rachav saved the life of these 2 spies. And she was gorgeous. Her beauty was something legendary. When does the saying of her name, the recitation of her name twice, cause the emission of the human seed of life? Only if somebody knew her, if somebody recognizes her, somebody was familiar with her. The Talmud continues the story. Ki havim miftiri mehadodi. When the two were leaving each other, when Reb Nachman and Reb Yitzchak were bidding farewell to each other, Amalei, Reb Nachman tells Reb Yitzchak, Levorchan mar, let the master give me a blessing. Amalei, Reb Yitzchak tells Reb Nachman, Emshalecha mashalama davradoima. Let me give you a metaphor. This is comparable to the following story, La Adam shayahilach b'midbar, v'hayira v'ayev v'tzama. There was a man traveling in a desert, and he was hungry and exhausted and thirsty. Umatza ilon sheperoisav mesukin v'tziloi nov amas hamayim everes tachtov. And the man found the tree. The fruits of the tree were sweet, its shade was pleasant, and a stream of water was passing under it. The man ate from the fruits of the tree, sat in the shade of the tree, and drank from the water passing under the tree. When the man wanted to leave, Amar, he said, Elon, Elon, tree, tree, with what shall I bless you? If I am to bless you, that your fruits should be sweet, your fruits are already sweet. Shall I bless you that your shade should be pleasant? Your shade is already pleasant. Should I bless you that a stream of water should pass under you? There is already a stream of water that passes under you. Ella, thus my blessing is Yehi Ratzon. May it be the will of the Almighty Shekol Netiyas Shenoitin Mimcha Yiyu Kamoischa, that all the shoots that are planted from you should be just like you. Your shoots, your offspring should reflect their progenitor, the original tree. They should have sweet fruits like you. They should have a pleasant shade like you. They should have water near them like you. They should be like you. Your shoots should be like you. Afata, the same is with you, Reb Nachman. With what blessing should I bless you? In b'Torah harei Torah. Should I bless you to have the gift of Torah, the light of Torah, the clarity of Torah, the depth of Torah, the learning of Torah, the meaning of Torah? You have Torah. In ba'oisha, should I bless you with wealth? Harei oisha, you have wealth. In bebonim, with children. Harei bonim, you have children. So with what should I bless you? Ella, my blessing is Yehi Ratzon, may it be the will of God. Sheyiyu tzetzoi me'echa kamoischa, that your offspring, those who come from you, literally tzetzoi, the children me'echa come from your womb, metaphorically, your children should be kamoischa, should be just like you. And that is the end of the Talmudic episode. Then the Talmud in Tainis Davav Amud Aleph goes on to a new discussion, the meaning of Yoyre and Malkish, a different theme, a different discussion and subject of the Talmud. Let's discuss the story for a moment. There are many questions, of course, that can be asked. But in addition to all the questions, let's understand, what is the theme that pervades the story? How are we to understand the sequence of the story? At first glance, it seems that the discussion between Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Yochanan during the meal and after the meal have absolutely no theme, no single thread that pervades their conversation. In the middle of the meal, when Rabbi Nachman asked Rabbi Yitzchak to say something, he says, Rabbi Yochanan said, there's no talking, it's dangerous. After the meal, he quotes him in the name of Rabbi Yochanan a statement. Jacob, our father, never died. And they discussed that. Why from all statements of Rabbi Yochanan did he choose this? Rabbi Yitzchak was a student of Rabbi Yochanan. He heard many insights from Rabbi Yochanan. In fact, in many places in Talmud, there are different ideas that he quotes in the name of his teacher Rabbi Yochanan. At this point, at the end of the meal, he chooses from an enormous reservoir of wisdom this statement and idea of Rabbi Yochanan that Jacob didn't die. Why this? When they finish discussing this statement, Rabbi Yitzchak tells Rabbi Nachman something else. If somebody says Rachav's name twice, he emits the seed of life. What's the connection? Why now? What's the point? What's the sequence? What's the logical continuation here? And then when he finishes this statement, the Reb Nachman and Rabbi Yitzchak are saying goodbye to each other. He asks him for a blessing, and he gives him this whole very interesting blessing with a story and a metaphor of a tree. Is there any connection between the four things? Rabbi Yitzchak told Reb Nachman, number one, you don't speak during a meal because it's dangerous. Afterwards, he tells him Jacob didn't die. The next is about Rachav. And finally, he blesses him. Like the blessing the man gave the tree, all the shoots that are planted from you should be like you. All your children should be like you. Some of the commentators ask this question and give different answers. The Ben Yehoyada, the Ben Ishchai, Rabbeinu Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, presents a long explanation trying to explain the sequence here. As we know, every story in the Talmud, every story in Torah, every idea in Torah can be explained on many different levels and on many different layers and from many different perspectives. There's many different vantage points. In fact, there's an interpretation commensurate with every state of consciousness in the human being and every type of world and universe. There is what we call pshat and remez and drush and soid, the literal interpretation of a story, the homiletical interpretation, the interconnected interpretation, the mystical interpretation. And each is true within its context, and all of them are also intertwined and interconnected. Tonight, I want to explore one perspective in this Talmudic episode. And it's based on a discussion presented by the Lubavitcher Rebbe at a public gathering, as a Fabrengen as it's known, on Chaf Av Tafshin Lamed Aleph, the 20th day of the Hebrew month of Av, his father's yahrzeit. The year was 1971. That is the nucleus of the discussion this evening, compiled from also some more sources to explain a few of the ideas and elaborate them and present them here. Reb Nachman and Reb Yitzchak are sitting at a meal. What is a meal? A meal is the act we engage in every single day to maintain and continue our life. A soul and a body cannot live together without the nutrition and the food that the person consumes during his or her meals. At the meal, Reb Nachman asks Reb Yitzchak, say something, and Reb Yitzchak says no. Reb Yochanan said there's no talking during a meal because it's dangerous. And a person ought never to endanger his or her life. The value of life, the sacredness of life is absolute. The dignity of life is invaluable. To speak during a meal could cause somebody, God forbid, to choke, and therefore there's no talking during the meal. So his very statement underscores the value of life, the importance of life, the sacredness of life, not to engage in anything which can, God forbid, endanger a person's life and cause the separation between the spirit, the soul, and the physical body. At the end of the meal, Rabbi Yitzchak continues on this very theme to Reb Nachman, to his colleague. And he tells him, Yaakov Avinu lo meis. Yaakov Avinu did not die. A meal works when the person is alive. The years that were allotted to the person, every person to live, during those years we have to eat and engage in continuous meals and have and acquire the nutrition, consume the nutrition, which will keep us alive. Here we come to a second point. Yaakov Avinu lo meis. Even after the meal is over, even after the party of life, the feast of life is over, even after it seems like the soul left the body and now the body is a lifeless corpse, it's after the meal and it's after all of the meals. By Yaakov, by our father Jacob, we find something unique. Lo meis. Even then, the soul is still connected to the body. Even then, there's still a life in Jacob. You could still say Jacob is alive. It's interesting. Tosfos points this out, that when it comes to Abraham, Avram Avinu, the Torah says he died. When it comes to Yitzchak, Isaac, the Torah said he died. When it comes to Yaakov in the portion of Vayechi, it doesn't say he died. The word that's used is Vayigva, he expired. So the word Vayamas, he died, does not say by Jacob, although it's a regular term used by Abraham and Isaac and many others in the Torah. Not by Yaakov, not by Jacob. Yaakov Avinu lo meis. Rabbi Yochanan says Yaakov didn't die. So he asks him, Reb Nachman says, what do you mean? The Torah says he was embalmed. Torah says he was eulogized. Torah says he was buried. What do you mean he didn't die? So Reb Yitzchak answers, Mikrani Doirish, I derive it from a verse. What does the verse say? The verse compares Jacob to his children. Mazare b'chayim afu b'chayim. Just as his seed is alive, he's also alive. What's the explanation in this? The commentators in the Talmud discuss this at length, and there are many different perspectives and interpretations. There's the famous perspective of Rashi, the most basic Talmudic commentator, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who believes that the Talmud means physically, that there's a certain element of life that still exists within Jacob's body. Although the Egyptians embalmed him, and he was buried and he was eulogized, as the Torah says in Vayechi, because from their perspective, they believed, they perceived him as dead. Nonetheless, the truth is that there is a certain element of life that still saturates Jacob's body. That's what Rashi says. Many commentators, like the Parsha and many others, believe that he is referring to the spiritual life of Jacob. That there's a certain spirituality in Jacob's life. The spiritual life of Jacob, his soulful life, that did not die. Yaakov Avinu lo meis. In that itself, there are different explanations. One of the very famous explanations is this. If life is only about the biology, if life is understood completely within the context of biology, of physicality, then indeed the soul leaves the body dies, the body is lifeless, the person has died. But if a person's life is not just about the fact that he or she eats and drinks and walks and breathes, and the fact that they have a blood circulation and the limbs and organs are functioning, but their life is about the positive influence they have on others, the positive influence they have on their environment, on the world around them. If their life, in other words, is not just about the material, physical fact that they are alive, but their life is also about the goodness, the holiness, the godliness they generate around them, in the world and by other people. And that is the primary theme of their life. Their body exists, but their body is a vehicle. Their body is an instrument through which their soul impacts the world and fills it with goodness and kindness and love and godliness and holiness. And their life is dedicated to reveal godliness and holiness in the world. Then, Yaakov Avinu lo meis. Then as long as they have children or students or disciples or friends who perpetuate their ideals, so when they physically die, they're not dead. Although their bodies may be corpse and they're buried and eulogized and embalmed, as in the case of Jacob, but to say that they're dead, their life is finished, would not be accurate. It would be an inaccurate statement. And the reason it would be an inaccurate statement is because if the purpose and the mission statement and the spark and the oomph that gave them life and their primary ambition was to influence others positively, as long as that influence exists in the world, so their life has true continuity in this world. It has continuity in all those people who emulate their deeds, who are inspired by their ideals, whose sparks have been kindled by their example, who are passionate and zestful because of their influence and their commitment and their conviction. So their ideals and their life and the theme of their life and the desires of their life and what they lived for continues to play itself out in the world through children, through students, through friends, and so on and so forth. So not only are they not dead, but sometimes they're even more alive than they were when they were physically present. Because suddenly you see they're physically not present, and yet their influence continues to increase and accelerate and take more root. So in a way, sometimes they're even more alive than when they were alive, as we see with certain individuals. And it's not just they're alive on some metaphysical level, on a soul level in heaven, but even physically, there are physical people walking on earth who are a physical continuation of their life. When you look at them, you can see a reflection and a mirror of that person who passed on, who's living on through this person because his ideals have inspired this person or these people. Yet here you may ask a simple question. Why Jacob? This is true of every good person and every righteous person. The soul of a person doesn't die, the soul lives on. And even their bodies, which pass on, the body dies. When they dedicate their life to generate goodness and to influence others positively, and that influence continues in their children and in their loved ones. So we could say about each and every one of them, loy meis, they didn't die. And yet Rabbi Yochanan said it about Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said it about Yaakov Avinu. Why is it Yaakov? So here we come to the next level, that there is something deeper. There is a deeper interpretation here which applies uniquely to Yaakov. On his deathbed, if I can use that term, Jacob speaks to each one of his children. He blesses each one of his children. The words he says to his oldest son are very significant. Please open your curriculum under the video to source number 2. Parshas Vayechi, Perik Mem Tes, Pasuk Gimel. Yaakov is speaking to his oldest son, Reuven, Pchoiriyata, you're my firstborn. Koichi, my strength, Vereishis Oini, and the beginning of my might. What did Jacob mean when he said that Reuven is not only his strength, but the beginning of his might? Zokt Rashi, see further in source number 2, Reishis Oini, he tipper Rishayna Shalai Ra Keri Miyamov. Reuven was the first seed of Jacob because he never had a seminal discharge until Reuven was conceived. So the first seed of life, sperm, that was emitted from Jacob's body was manifested and it was conceived, and that became his firstborn Reuven. You're the beginning of my might. Tipur Rishayna Shalai, his first seed of life. Source number 3. Zog the Rambam. Rambam Hilchos Deis Perek Dalet Halacha Yutes. Maimonides tells us in his laws, Shichva Zera, the seed of life, the sperm in a human body, he koyach haguf v'chayav, constitutes the strength of the body and its life. U'ma'orei einayim, and the light of the eyes. V'chol sheteitze b'yoser haguf kala v'koychoy kala v'chayav oivdim. If it's emitted a lot from the body disintegrates, the body perishes, the person's power ceases and perishes, declines, and the human life is lost. Life is lost. This is what King Solomon said in his wisdom. Al titen lenoshim chelecha. Don't squander your strength, your inner might. So the Rambam tells us here that the seed of life constitutes the very koyach haguf, the very strength of the body, and chayav in a person's life and the light of eyes. And therefore the Rambam says, one ought to be very careful with this seed of life, that it should not be squandered and emitted wastefully, because what is damaged by this, the very body, the very core of a person's life, guf, koiche, and chayav. In many other sources in Judaism, this theme is explained in many different ways and elaborated on, explaining why the Torah cautions the person never to wastefully emit the seed of life, that the seed of life essentially constitutes the deepest part of the human self. In fact, it's the only part of the human self which can create a new person. Anything that comes from our body Even the greatest talents that come from our arms and our legs and our mouth, our wisdom, our creations, could never create another human being like ourselves. But the seed of life, this is the part of the person that comes from the deepest core in the human being. It constitutes your very quintessence, and therefore it has within it the potentiality to create a new person when it is conceived and developed into a fetus. So it's not just an element of the body. It's not just a component of life. It's rather the deepest part which captures the very essence of the soul, and therefore that has within it the potential to create a whole human being just like you. And thus, the Torah cautions a person never allow such a thing to be squandered. When you're standing face to face with the very essence of self, don't wastefully emit it. Don't be insensitive to it. Don't just let it be squandered for any instinct or temptation or craving. This you have to have a tremendous sensitivity to. There's tremendous power in it. It has your very essence in it. Such a thing must be safeguarded with enormous respect and dignity, and could never be allowed just to be squandered and lost because the person is in a bad mood, or the person is melancholy or depressed, or has a temptation, or has an instinct, or has a craving, or has an appetite or an inclination, or whatever adjective you want to use is really irrelevant. But the very point is, this element of your life you have to treat with the greatest respect and reverence and dignity when it's accessed and when it's used, when it's utilized. Which is also the reason Hasidic works explain, Kabbalistic and Hasidic works explain, that according to nature that God created, it also captures one of the greatest, if not the greatest, pleasure in a human life. What's the great pleasure and delight in this experience? It's something that baffles scientists, biologists, psychologists. Why is the emission of the seed of life so pleasurable? What's the cause for it? So the Darwinists give all their explanations and insights, which I'm not going to get into at the moment. One of the great insights explained in Jewish mysticism is that it actually captures the deepest part of the human essence, the human identity, the human soul. And when it's actualized and expressed, it therefore creates tremendous pleasure because it's the deepest form of self-expression. And in fact, it's the most divine, godly part of a person. Because that's the component that God gave us, which allows us to be godlike, to create life just like God. God creates life and we create life through the seed of life. So that's the component when expressed. We are the most divine, we are the most godlike, and therefore it allows us to create a new life and create a life which will continue for eternity, just as God can create a life for eternity. So it's the most divine and spiritual, sublime and powerful part, and when you're standing face to face with God, every detail counts, and every experience counts, and every nuance counts, and this you don't squander. This is also true psychologically. Even from, I believe, a secular point of view. When a person, say, is in a bad mood, or is feeling down, or low, or a little depressed, or melancholy, and in order to gratify themselves and to make their lives a little happier, and to get out of their misery, so some people will engage in this act of emitting the seed of life. It's actually one of the worst things they can do for themselves. Because when they discharge their seed of life, what happens is, it's one of the greatest escapes from them, their self-awareness. If you will allow your pain to remain within you, let it simmer within you. Don't immediately escape to discharge seed and therefore gratify yourself instantaneously. Let what's bothering you remain in you. Take control of yourself. Let your soul remain in you. Then after a while, you could analyze and dissect what's bothering you. And then you can go and try to mend and fix the core of the problem, not just put on a Band-Aid so that it looks good, but rather get into your very system and try to heal. Try to grow. Try to figure out who you are. But when a person doesn't give himself or herself that dignity, when a person doesn't believe in his ability to heal and to grow truly, then a person will engage in this because it's very powerful gratification. It's instant, it's fast, it doesn't cost money, you don't need anybody else physically. And it's a tremendous escape from the self. The person does it, they feel great pleasure and gratification, but they completely escaped from understanding who they are because all of what they were feeling was now discharged, and when it happens again and again, the person becomes more alienated from themselves and more alienated with less awareness and less self-awareness and understanding. The same is true when it comes, of course, to the realm of marriage. As many sources within Judaism explain it, although in different ways and different terminology that's used. When a person who's married, for example, engages in this act which is prohibited by the Torah, it's a certain form of adultery. Because the passion and the sense of intimacy that is reserved for the relationship between a husband and a wife is now being shared by the husband with somebody else. And then people wonder why they cannot stimulate their interest and their passion when they have to stimulate it in the context of their marriage. How could they? When that inner power and vigor and passion and enthusiasm and love has been shared with other realities and other circumstances and other situations. So what it does is the person is being fragmented and splintered, and it's a certain subtle form of adultery. Because what's being experienced during such wasteful emission is being taken away from the person's marriage, from the person's relationship, from the person's spouse. Then there's another element that's discussed in Kabbalah, and that is the emission of seed creates a spiritual soul. Even a married couple which has intimacy and there's no conception, there's no physical child, or an elderly couple, or a couple which can't have children. But the proper intimacy which is appropriate according to the blueprint of Torah, which wants a person to experience an intimacy that is healthy for the body and for the soul and for the psychological wholesomeness and holistic energy of the person, explains that a seed of life creates a certain spiritual entity, spiritual reality, a certain neshama, even if it's not manifested within a physical body. And if this emission is wasteful, one has to be extremely sensitive to what happened, because there was a spiritual force that was created, and now it may be lost. It may be lost in the spiritual chaos that exists within existence. And there's much more to discuss on this topic, but this is what Yaakov meant when he tells Reuven, you are koichi v'reishis oini, that the first emission of Jacob's seed was conceived through the child called Reuven. And by the way, this explains also something very interesting. There's a custom in Jerusalem and in other Jewish communities based on teachings of Kabbalah that at a funeral, children don't follow the coffin of a parent. Children, grandchildren, descendants of the person who died, they don't follow the coffin during the funeral. What's the reason for this? It's a custom practiced in Jerusalem and in many other Jewish communities. So one of the reasons for this given in works of Jewish mysticism is that when a person wastefully emits seed of life, it creates some type of spiritual energy. But that spiritual energy, if it was not created in the proper context, where this emission is healthy spiritually and physically and psychologically and emotionally, sometimes is associated with a lot of negative and destructive energy. When the children and grandchildren escort and follow the coffin of the person who died, who else comes around? It says in Kabbalah, other children come around. Which children? Not the physical children. The spiritual and metaphysical children, so to speak, created by those seeds of life, also want to follow their father. And we don't want them following. So therefore, This custom says no descendant should follow the coffin. So I saw when somebody once asked the Lubavitcher Rebbe, it says in Parshas Vayechi, who carried Jacob's bed, who carried Jacob's coffin, who carried his body? Vayisu oisei bonov, his children. In fact, he said it should be that way, with the exact formations. And they're the ones who carried their very father. How did that happen? So the Rebbe answered, he says it's very simple. Yaakov told Reuven, Koichi v'reishis oini, you're the beginning of my might, you're the genesis of my vigor. So Rashi says that Yaakov never emitted the seed of life in a wasteful fashion. So with Jacob there was no issue. Certainly his children and grandchildren could follow his aron, his coffin, to the burial place in Hebron in the cave of Machpelah. Now we can understand the story in the Talmud in a much deeper fashion. Let's go back to the story. Rabbi Yitzchak said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Yaakov Avinu lo yimeis, Yaakov didn't die. Ma zarei b'chayim, mafu b'chayim. Zarei b'chayim literally means zarei, his seed, is b'chayim, is alive. And what it means also is that by Jacob, in Yaakov's life, there was something unique. Zarei, yet der zera. Every seed of life of Jacob, b'chayim, was oriented and channeled and directed and harnessed into life. It propagated life. Never did it happen in Jacob's life that his zarei, the seed of his life, should be emitted in a wasteful or senseless or meaningless fashion, should be squandered. Wherever there was an expression and a revelation of zarei, of his seed of life, coming from the very essence of a person's body, as the Rambam explains, quoted earlier, it b'chayim, it was transformed and directed into life, never into death, never into a meaningless setting, a themeless setting, something vain, something futile, something which represents death. It never died. Every zera of Yaakov was b'chayim, is givaron lebedik. It was used for something living, for something alive, for a living relationship, for a living child. So when we say Yaakov Avinu lo yimeis, we don't only mean he didn't die after he died. It also means when he lived, he didn't die. Sometimes a person could be physically, biologically alive, but so much of them dies. So many deep things in them are allowed to die, are allowed to be lost, to perish. Just a person doesn't have control over their life, doesn't have control over their identity, doesn't have control over their destiny, especially when they allow the zera levatala, they allow, like the Rambam says, the koyach haguf, the very core of the body, and as the Kabbalah says, the very core of the soul, to be squandered and nothing. So some of the deepest parts of themselves are allowed to die. Yaakov Avinu lo yimeis, even when he was alive, koichi v'reishis oini. So what's the next piece in the Talmud? Right after this? Right after this, what does Rabbi Yitzchak tell Rabbi Yochanan? Kol ha'omer rachav rachav miyad nikri. The exact opposite. Somebody who says the name Rachav twice will experience an emission of sperm. What's the connection? You just spoke about Yaakov not dying. What's the connection to Rachav? Who is Rachav? As I said earlier, when Joshua sends 2 spies to scout the land of Israel, they come to Jericho, Yericho, and they stay in the home of a woman named Rachav Hazayna. There's 2 interpretations what Rachav Hazayna means. One interpretation is that she owned a hotel. She would give people to eat. Most commentators, however, explain Zayna as it's usually referred to in Tanakh, that she was a harlot. Open up source number 4. Zog the Gemara Megillah Daf Tesvav Amud Aleph, Tractate Megillah, page 15. Taner Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Arba Noshim Yefyefiyas Hayu Ba'olam, Sarah, Avigail, Rachav, Esther. There were 4 most beautiful women in the world: Sarah, Avigail, Rachav, and Queen Esther. So Rachav is considered one of the 4 most beautiful women in the world. Source number 5, the Gemara says in Zvachim Kufta Zayin Amid Aleph, Amar Mar Ein Lecha Kol Sar V'Nugget Shlei Ba'arachav Azayna. There was not one ruler or prince in the land of Canaan who did not have intimacy with Rachav. Amru Bas Yut Shanim Hoisek Shiyatzi Yisrael Mitzrayim V'Zonsam Mem Shana Shai Yisrael B'Midbar. She was 10 years old when the Jews left Egypt. The Jews traveled the wilderness for 40 years. During those years, she was involved in promiscuous relationships. Achar Nun Shana Nizgair. After 50 years, she's 50 years old. She converts to Judaism. Amra, she says, Ye machuli b'schar chevel chaloinu pishtim. My sins will be forgiven for the reward that I saved the spies of Joshua. In fact, the Gemara says elsewhere, the Midrash says, there's a tradition that Rachav married Yehoshua ben Nun, the leader of the Jewish people, the pupil of Moses after she converted. As the Talmud says, when she was 50 years old, she marries Yehoshua. She also saves herself and her whole family in Jericho when the Jews come and conquer that city in order to take over the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael. In fact, the Gemara says that some of the greatest prophets and Kohanim of Israel came from Rachav, including Yirmiyahu Hanavi, including Yecheskel Hanavi, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Chulda Hanaviah, the famous prophet is the woman Chulda, and many others the Gemara lists in Tractate Megillah and other places in Medrash. So now back to the story Rabbi Yitzchak tells Rabbi Yochanan, somebody who says Rachav was so beautiful, can have a wasteful emission. So he says, it's not true. I said Rachav, nothing happened. He says it's different. If you knew her, if you saw her, if you're familiar with her, her impact was so deep, her impact was so penetrating, that this is what it causes. Biologically, there's a cause. B'yodo makir, if you knew her. That's how deep it's in the person. Rachav, just the name, just saying the name. What is he showing? He's showing the contrast. And our person has to be cautious. Yaakov Avinu loy meis, mazare b'chayim. Every seed of Yaakov Avinu was channeled into life. As he tells Reuven, you are Reishis Oini, you the beginning of my might. This is the first manifestation of a seed of life. Fully alive. No seed of the person's soul was squandered not for a purpose of life. Physical life or spiritual life. The contrast of that is Oimer Rachav. Somebody just said it. But even words can be so powerful and can take over the person so deeply that under certain circumstances, if he knew Rachav, it can have the opposite effect of the way it was by Jacob. Kol Oimer Rachav miyad nikri. That there is a meaningless emission of the very seed of life, which the Rambam says is the power of the body, the core of life, and the light of the eyes. Which, just as this is true concerning Jacob's seed, it's also true concerning Jacob's entire life. What his life represented. And this is the difference between Yaakov and Avraham and Yitzchak. Concerning Avraham, we know not all of his children continue to follow his way of life. One of his children, Ishmael, chose a different path. Concerning Yitzchak, not all of his children continue to follow his path and his ideals. He had a son, Esau, who took another path. Concerning Yaakov, the Talmud says in the famous expression in Pesachim, mitasoi shleima. His bed was complete. What does it mean his bed was complete? That each one of his children, each one of his 12 sons, from Reuven through Benjamin, including Dinah, his daughter, each one of them in their own way, in their own path, continued to follow the life of Jacob, continued to teach and live by the ideals, the convictions, the value system, the morals, and the faith and the covenant of Yaakov Avinu. In fact, the Gemara tells a story in Tractate Pesachim that when Yaakov was on his deathbed, he was fearful that perhaps one of his children does have a very deep blemish and spiritually disassociated from the value system of the family. And his sons told him, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Kashem Shem Belibcha Ela Echad, Kachem Belibenu Ela Echad. Hear Israel, our God is one. Just as in your heart is one, in our heart is also only one. And when Yaakov heard that, he said, Baruch Shem Kvod Malchusei L'Olam Vad. Blessed is the name of the glory of his kingship forever. So this then is the difference between the seed and the children of Avraham and Yitzchak and the seed of Yaakov Avinu. By Yaakov Avinu, every one of his children continued to live out Yaakov's life. Not one child disappointed. Not one child took a different path. Therefore, Zarei Bachayim, all of his children continued his life. It's not just that some of his children continued his life. Each one of his children continued his life. So the Hu Bachayim, Yaakov's life, he lives on through each one of his children. When it comes to Avraham and Yitzchak, a part of a father's life goes to a child. A part of the father's seed goes into the child. The father's seed becomes the child together with the mother's egg. And the father's energy and soul is given to the child. Yitzchak continued Avraham's life, but Yishmael did not. Yaakov continued Yitzchak's life, but Esav did not. So that part of Avraham and that part of Yitzchak, the channel to Yishmael and Esav, were somewhat lost. When it came, however, to Yaakov, Zarei Bachayim, each one of his children, continues to embody and personify and propagate the life of Yaakov Avinu, inspired by his ideals, living by his convictions, touched by his emotions, transformed by his dedication, and dedicated to teach it to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The path of Torah, the path of ethical monotheism, the path of righteousness and goodness and holiness that Yaakov introduced into the world from his father Yitzchak and from his father Avraham. So Hu Bachayim, the whole life of Jacob continues. Because the part that he gave Reuven and Shimon and Levi and Yehuda, all the way down, Yosef and Binyamin and Dinah, every part of his, which was given to each one of his children, each one of those parts continues to live throughout all of the generations, because Bal Yidach Mimenu Nidach, we know that no Jewish soul is ever lost. And ultimately every single soul finds its way back to the bosom of Yaakov, of our father Jacob. So ultimately every one of the children, which carries something of the seed and of the energy and of the soul of Jacob, each one of them carries in it the flame of Jacob, and that flame will one day be kindled. So Hu Bachayim, the totality of Yaakov, all aspects of his life, his entire seed, even after his death, Hu Bachayim continues to live. Nothing, not one energy was that given to his children was squandered, and not one energy is lost, where you could say this piece of Yaakov is lost. It died. It did not die, because all of Jacob continues to live through his children. Now we can understand the end of the story. During the meal, he says, we can't talk, you can't endanger your life. At the end of the meal, he speaks about a deeper level of life, Yaakov Avinu, who doesn't die even afterwards. Why? Because his seed is always alive. And since his seed was always alive, he's also alive. He contrasts that with somebody who says, Rachav, Rachav. And now the Talmud comes to the end of the story. When Reb Nachman and Reb Yitzchak were bidding farewell to each other, he asks him for a blessing. So he tells him the metaphor of a man who's by a tree and enjoys the tree and the shade and the water, and then he says, Elon, Elon, b'meh avarechecha. With what shall I bless you, tree, tree? Bless you with a shade, you have a beautiful shade. Bless you with sweet fruits, you have. Bless you with water, you have. I'm going to bless you that all of the shoots which come from you should be like you. So he says, Reb Nachman, this is what I'm going to bless you. Torah you have. wealth you have, children you have. Thank God. What am I going to bless you? I'm going to bless you that said, Soy me'echa should be kamoischa. Your children should continue you. Your children should reflect you. Here we have a singular theme. He blesses him with Zaroi Bachayim. Your children should be alive. And what type of life? A life that will allow you to be alive. So that you can experience something of the Yaakov Avinu Loimes. It's not just you have children. It's that you live a type of life that inspires people around you and brings goodness to people around you. A life which inspires your children, that when they become fathers or they become mothers, they want to emulate you. Naturally, instinctively, they become what you were. They embody your goodness, your truth, your integrity, your love, your awe, your dedication, your convictions, your faith, your courage, your joy. So hu b'chaim. You live through them, you live in them. Their story does not end. Your story does not end with your death. Your story continues because their story is a continuation of your story. Your melody doesn't end because their melody is a continuation of your melody. Your ideals don't end because their ideals are a continuation of your ideals. And the blessing includes something deeper. The children which come from your womb. Of course, children don't come from a father's womb. It's not just metaphoric. It's referring here to the other interpretation in Zarei B'chayim. May all of your children be kamoischa. Your children here refers to the seed of life. All your seeds of life, which encapsulate your children. They have the potential to create children. All your seeds of life should be kamoischa. They should be a continuation of you. They should be like you. They shouldn't be squandered, meaningless, worthless, cover-ups. They should become moischa. They should continue who you are. You should know all of them. You should understand and know every seed of yours. It should be a part of you, a continuation of you, should reflect you, should be a part of your life. Zaroi b'chayim. And then afhu b'chayim. Have a wonderful night.
Bamo שכל נטיוס שנויתי ממך יהיו כמו